All right, when we take the ECA, we're going to have to be able to read and understand poems. And the first thing that we're going to do is we have to understand patterns when it comes to poetry. In particular, there are some major patterns that you can see in a poem even without reading it. And this is something you should do when you read a poem. You should physically scan it. So the first thing we're going to look for are what are called stanzas. Stanzas are paragraphs inside of poems. In this case, we have a stanza right here because it's set aside. And we've also noticed that it has 4 lines. If we were to count the number of stanzas in this poem, it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's one way of looking at a pattern. If we look at a different poem that we've studied in the last couple days, this would be a stanza, 1, 2, 3, 4. If we look at a different poem that we have also done in the last couple days, we would see here's a stanza here, 1, 2. But this is where it gets strange because this line counts as its own stanza. The author purposely set one line aside and made that its own stanza, a one-line stanza. And then what happens next is the author then has another stanza here, and this one's odd because it has only 3 lines. Then it goes back to the number of regular-looking stanzas. So when we see stanzas in poetry, that's patterns that we need to look for. And the question you need to ask yourself is, why does the author do those types of patterns? The second part then about looking at patterns is to count the number of lines in each one. In this one, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, and we have 4 lines in all of the stanzas here. In this one, we had 4 lines. We had 4 lines here, but in this case, we had 1 line, and this one only had 3. So long story short, in this case, there was a pattern that was established up into a certain point where there were 4 lines in each, but the tone on one side is different than the tone on the other. So that's another way in which we look for patterns inside of the poems. And then the last thing that we need to do is look at the pattern of meter. Meter refers to the number of syllables per line, but you're never going to be asked what meter a poem is in. But if you can detect that there's a pattern to things, you'll be in good shape. In this case, then, if we count the number of syllables in the first line, I had been hungry all the years, we'll notice that there are 8 syllables in this line. My noon had come to dine. We'll notice that there were 6 lines in this one. If we go then to the next line, I, trembling, drew the table near. We'll notice that there were 8 lines there. And touched the curious wine, there were 6. And actually, if we follow the pattern all the way down, there actually is going to be 8 in this line, 8 syllables, 6, 8, and 6. So when you start to see that there's a pattern to those things, you have to know that the tone is probably going to be very formal. If the author took that kind of time to put things in an organized fashion between the stanzas as well as how many syllables there were per line, you can tell that this is going to be a formal and rather important poem. So structural features of poetry are fair game for the ECA, being able to detect these patterns of stanzas, lines, as well as the number of syllables per line will be very beneficial on the ECA.